This story is about a crash survivor stranded on a deadly jungle moon, injured, alone, and face to face with a legendary predator. Ethan didn't remember the crash. One moment he'd been nursing a lukewarm coffee bulb, listening to a static-filled podcast about aggressive musical diplomacy on Korriban 6, and the next, the shuttle's hull screamed like a dying beast, alarms blared with a sort of polite panic, and everything went violently dark. He woke to the rustle of giant leaves swaying overhead, with blood crusted to the side of his head, and his right leg twisted at a wrong, nausea-inducing angle. His helmet visor was cracked. His comms light blinked pathetically. There was no sound from the beacon. He tapped it once, twice, then harder. Nothing. Great, he muttered, spitting a mouthful of dirt. Calyx 9. The jungle moon, with a Yelp rating of just die already. His ribcage throbbed with every breath, and he couldn't lift his left arm fully. At least he could move his fingers. That counted for something. Ethan grimaced as he reached for the emergency med kit dangling from his shoulder strap, popping a painkiller vial under his tongue. The taste was awful, like sour mint and regret, but the edges of pain dulled enough for him to think. He activated the survival HUD overlay. It flickered, then died. His suit's auxiliary power cell was drained, and the main had been fried. Which explained the cold. Even on Calyx 9, a humid hothouse of carnivorous moss and aggressive ferns, he was shivering slightly. He was alone, probably the only survivor. Worse, he was in a quadrant of Calyx 9 flagged on every interstellar map, with the glowing crimson symbol for "Don't go here, idiot." Technically, that symbol meant unexplored, due to repeated loss of exploratory units, but in practice it translated to that exact warning. Ethan took stock. Broken leg. Probably fractured ribs. Dislocated shoulder. No comms. No power. No idea what might be watching from the neon foliage. And of course, no documented fauna. Calyx 9 didn't believe in letting science teams leave alive. He blinked up at the canopy. A fluorescent moth the size of a house cat stared back at him with all the detached interest of a bureaucrat on a lunch break. "Could use a hand, buddy," Ethan muttered. The moth flapped away. With immense care, he began to crawl. He moved an inch at a time through the dense glowing undergrowth. Some of it recoiled from his touch. Some reached back. His leg, he wasn't looking at it, not now, dragged behind him like dead weight. The pain flared constantly, punctuated by sharp stabs every time he hit a root or rock. Hours passed. Or days. The painkillers blurred the line. He ate ration paste. He drank condensation. He tried not to sleep because nightmares about teeth were real and unhelpful. Then it happened. The jungle shifted. The bioluminescent light dimmed, as though the moon itself had blinked. Ethan stopped, frozen, in the middle of a slowly uncurling plant that smelled faintly of burnt cinnamon. He looked up. It was massive. 7, maybe 8 feet tall, not including the crest of sleek black ridges along its spine. Muscles moved beneath midnight purple skin, limbs long and jointed at uncomfortable angles. Its head was elongated, predatory, eyes a trio of reflective slits. The Zarnax. No one had ever recorded one. No footage, no remains, only vanished patrols and shredded black boxes. It stood inches from his face, and it smiled. Not a warm, crinkly-eyed grin, not even a sarcastic smirk. This was a full-on tooth-bearing gesture. Huge fangs, perfectly arranged in a mouth that had absolutely no business looking amused, gleamed under the moonlight. Ethan blinked slowly. Then the adrenaline wore off, and his vision tilted sideways. He came to in a small clearing. It wasn't the crash site. The trees were denser here, the plants reacting oddly to his presence, drawing back from the edges of his suit like they feared contamination. Zarnak stood at the edge, unmoving, watching, still smiling. For a horrifying second, Ethan thought maybe it was just waiting for him to die. But then something clicked. The posture, the restraint. It could have ended him easily. No claws, no tearing, just a quiet snap of the neck. But it hadn't. It was recording. A small orb hovered near the predator's head, blinking faintly. Not a drone, exactly, more like a living camera. The Zarnax gestured once, and the orb swiveled toward Ethan's face. He felt his blood turn to ice. This wasn't a hunt. This was a test. And that smile, that wasn't friendliness. It was a challenge. Ethan's breath hitched. He'd seen this before. In briefings, in obscure cultural journals, in behavioral studies that were dismissed as hypothetical nonsense. Among the Zarnax, teeth-baring was a form of mental contest, a silent duel of endurance, a challenge to see who would break first. Ethan wasn't just a pilot. Before being assigned to shuttle duty, low profile, quiet, perfect for recovering from his last assignment, he'd been a xenopsych specialist, a damn good one. He looked into the predator's eyes and saw it. Expectation. It believed humans had a trigger. A moment when the mind collapsed under stress and all reasoning faded. That was when it would strike, not before. It wanted him to fall apart. Wanted to study it. Maybe not just for itself. He gave a short, bitter laugh. You're filming for an audience. The orb blinked. Ethan took stock again. He was injured, severely, but not hopeless. Not yet. He tore open the medkit, finding 2 more painkillers and a compact bone brace. He strapped it to his leg, gritting his teeth through the waves of pain. Then he wrapped pressure bandage after pressure bandage around his torso. It wasn't much, but it held him together. The Zarnax cocked its head. Oh, you're into long-form suffering, good to know. He crawled away again, slowly, pretending he didn't feel the burning gaze on his back. That night, he built a fire using his suit's backup heat filament and a clump of dry moss. Not for warmth, for visibility. Let it see he was still alive, still lucid. Daylight, or what passed for it, crept over the horizon in shifting greens and soft lavender. Ethan scrawled notes into a data slate using a snapped stylus and some fluid from his suit's cooling line. His thoughts were disjointed but focused. If it wanted performance, he'd give it one. He started with noise. Using a chunk of the shuttle's cracked hull plate he'd dragged along, he mimicked the shriek call he'd heard from another predator species days earlier. The sound echoed strangely, reverberating across the canopy. The Zarnax tensed, then vanished into the trees. It returned an hour later, no damage. But it didn't smile this time. Ethan took that as a point. The next stunt was riskier. He vented one of the suit's battery cells, igniting it with the fire filament. A flare burst upward in a column of bright blue light. The jungle shuddered, small creatures scattered. The Zarnax stepped back instinctively, then leaned in with sudden interest. Ethan smiled. Not the dumb prey you were hoping for, huh? His leg ached constantly now, and his ribs stabbed him whenever he twisted wrong. He was burning calories fast, but the ration paste had run out. He tried chewing a jungle fruit. It tasted like battery acid and moldy apricot. Still, he kept it down. The Zarnax observed. Always. On the 5th day, Ethan faked a collapse. He'd been watching it too, learning its cadence, its approach, when it expected him to move next. And just before that, he went limp, eyes half-lidded, lips blue with effort. He lay there for hours. Then, when the predator edged closer, head tilted, nostrils flared, he snapped upright and launched a handful of scavenged phosphorus dust into the air. The flash seared the clearing. The Zarnax recoiled. Ethan laughed until he coughed blood. Another point. He crawled back toward the shuttle's remains that night, dragging his broken leg with renewed fury. Tomorrow, he would start phase 2. He would speak to the jungle in the predator's voice. He would make it doubt itself. The shuttle wreckage looked even more pathetic than Ethan remembered. Most of the aft section had been pulverized into scrap on impact, scattered across a 50-meter radius. The cockpit, what was left of it, was a skeleton of melted alloy and ruptured panels. But nestled in the debris was something Ethan had crawled 3 days to find again: the grav drive core. He hadn't come for propulsion. That thing would never fly again. He'd come for what the drive could fake. The Zarnax had a social hierarchy based on display and challenge. That much he'd pieced together from its behavior and the flickering presence of the floating orb that kept dutifully recording his every move. The smile, the prolonged stalking, the test of endurance, it all pointed toward a ritualized system, probably built on dominance cues. And somewhere in that ritual, there had to be something that frightened even them. He would become that something. First, he had to survive the climb. The grav core was jammed into what used to be the primary junction bulkhead, half buried under twisted metal. Every movement jolted his broken leg, sent lightning through his ribs, but Ethan bit down on the scream and kept working. He levered a scorched support strut into position, braced it under the edge, and pushed until the casing cracked free. The grav drive hummed faintly, its core intact. The casing had melted in places, but the power field was still active. Ethan pried open the panel and found the pulse modulator hanging by a thread. "Still alive," he whispered. "We're two broken freaks in a jungle full of teeth." Behind him, a soft branch cracked. He didn't turn. Didn't need to. It was there, watching. He could feel the pressure of its presence like humidity on his skin. That same stillness, that silent intensity. He glanced at the orb. It hovered 10 feet away now, clearly interested. Ethan twisted the pulse settings carefully. He'd reviewed Zarnax's physiology in his old job. Their species responded to low-frequency pressure pulses during mating season, faint subsonic broadcasts, barely detectable to human ears, marked territory, claimed dominance, called rivals. Or mates. If he got the settings right, this wouldn't be just a distress beacon. It would be a declaration. And if he got it wrong, it might just call every predator in a 10-mile radius. "Live a little," he muttered, fingers trembling as he adjusted the resonator coils. He activated the pulse. A low thrum passed through the ground. Insects scattered. Bioluminescent plants dimmed as though holding their breath. The Zarnax froze. For the first time since the crash, it looked confused. Ethan allowed himself a slow exhale. "Got your attention, didn't I?" The predator didn't approach. Didn't retreat either. It simply stood there, processing. Ethan slumped against the bulkhead, trying not to black out. The pain was a constant now, less an alert and more an identity. He was pain. Pain and mud and tenacity. His leg looked worse, deep purple with angry swelling, the splint barely holding. He knew what that meant: tissue damage, possibly necrosis. If infection had set in, he'd need real medical attention within days. The orb drifted closer, humming softly. "Still filming? Good. Let's make this a classic." The next 2 days blurred together. He camped in the wreckage, using emergency sealant to reinforce the ruined cockpit canopy into a makeshift shelter. Not for comfort, for line of sight. He needed vantage. He continued broadcasting the pulse at irregular intervals, sometimes short bursts, sometimes long waves. The Zarnax came closer each time. Once it circled the shuttle. Another time it crouched just outside the canopy, head tilted, breathing slow and deep. Ethan talked to it then. "Don't suppose you want to compare notes? You test willpower, we test radiation tolerance. Same game, different flavor." The Zarnax said nothing, but it didn't smile either. It progressed. On the third morning, it brought him something. A dead creature, 6-legged, armored, and oozing black fluid. It dropped it at the edge of the clearing and sat back. A gift? To threat? A taunt? Ethan wasn't sure, but he understood one thing. It was watching how he'd react. So, he reacted. He picked up the carcass, grunting, hissing through clenched teeth, and dissected it with a piece of shuttle panel, carefully, methodically, like a scientist. He didn't flinch at the smell. He analyzed it out loud, noting muscle structure, heat retention, fluid pressure. He even named it Gary. The Zarnax blinked slowly. "I've got naming rights," Ethan explained. "I'm the one with the camera." That night, he fell into a fever. His leg had begun to weep. A foul-smelling yellow discharge leaked from the edge of the old wound. He cleaned it with purified water from his suit's recycling line, gritted his teeth through the screaming pain, and rewrapped the bandages with shredded thermal mesh. No antibiotics left, just willpower now. The orb floated closer while he slept. When he woke, the Zarnax was gone. The jungle was wrong. Too quiet. Ethan looked around, feeling the shift in atmosphere. The animals had scattered. The plants somehow seemed less vibrant. Then he heard it. A second pulse. Not from his drive, from somewhere beyond the trees. His signal had worked. He dragged himself onto a ridge near the wreckage, bracing his leg with salvaged carbon rods. His ribs burned with every breath. One lung was probably bruised, maybe worse, but he had to move. The Zarnax returned before noon. This time, it didn't smile. It looked toward the trees. A sound, deep, guttural, like the moon itself growling, rolled through the air. Another Zarnax. Bigger, heavier. Ethan didn't wait. He triggered the grav drive to emit one last massive pulse, a flare of subsonic energy that shook the leaves off trees and cracked a nearby boulder. Both predators flinched. Then they turned toward each other. Ethan used the chaos to crawl, 1 inch at a time, toward the high ridge. His repaired beacon was there, tucked beneath a signal dish he'd reassembled from scrap and broken shielding. It wasn't perfect, but it had power now. Behind him, the forest exploded into motion. Branches shattered. Something roared. He reached the ridge, climbed, bit back a scream as his leg twisted wrong. Made it to the top. The beacon whined to life. Its signal light blinked. A transmission burst upward, cutting through Calyx 9's dense atmosphere with a warbling cry of desperation. Then Ethan collapsed beside it, barely breathing. From below, he heard the sounds of battle. One predator shrieked in rage, another bellowed in response. It didn't matter who won. He'd gotten out. He lay there, filthy, broken, bleeding, and grinned up at the pale sky. "Well," he rasped, "guess that's a wrap for episode 1. Ethan was unconscious for nearly 18 hours. He knew this because when he woke, the sun had shifted completely, and his suit's last working chronometer displayed a suspiciously rounded 1752 mark, right before flickering and dying for good. His first sensation was the ache, not the sharp stabbing kind anymore. This was dull and vast and soaked into everything. His broken leg was swollen tight against the brace, his ribs barely expanded. Every breath came with a wet rattle, but the beacon light blinked, steady and green. That alone gave him the will to roll onto his side. Below the ridge, the jungle looked like it had been visited by a meteor. Trees torn from the earth, clawed trenches in the soil. Fluorescent leaves fluttered like confetti over a crater-sized clearing, filled with silence and wreckage. Whatever had come in response to his signal mate, rival, or something in between, it had fought hard. The Zarnax that had stalked him, it was gone. Dead, maybe. Or just finished with the test. Ethan coughed, blood tinged pink. If I pass this test, someone better give me tenure. He didn't have the strength to move. So he waited. 6 hours later, a vibration tickled the ground. Not like the pulse he'd created, this one came with a hum. Low, mechanical, familiar. A dropship. Ethan blinked hard. Wasn't a hallucination. He raised his arm, managed a wave. Or something close to it. The patrol vessel descended slowly through the canopy, carving a path with its deflectors. Dust and pollen blasted in all directions. The ship bore coalition rescue colors, the insignia dulled by soot and wear. As the ramp extended, Ethan let his body go slack. He didn't need to fight anymore. Two figures in dark med suits ran forward. They shouted something, but the words were swallowed by the roar in his ears. A moment later, he felt hands on his chest, a mask pressed to his face, and the clean, antiseptic bite of medical-grade oxygen. Blackness claimed him again, soft and final. He woke 2 days later in an orbital trauma pod. The sterile hum of medical machines greeted him. Soft light filtered through frost glass panels. He was encased in a half-rigid exosplint. His leg had been set and suspended, his torso wrapped tight, his arm fixed with microstim lines, a catheter, an IV. Ethan blinked against the lights. His mouth tasted like old gauze and metal. Then came the voice. "Mr. Hayes, if you can hear me, blink twice." A shadow moved closer. A man with dark features, close-cropped hair, and the lean build of a field surgeon. "I'm Lieutenant Dr. Salazar. You're in Medbay Theta 4 on the Coalition support frigate Seeker's Rise. You've been unconscious for 49 hours. You suffered a compound fracture of the tibia and fibula, multiple rib fractures, severe soft tissue infection, 2 partially collapsed lungs, and dehydration. You should be dead." Ethan rasped, "I overslept." Salazar didn't laugh, but the monitor beeped a little faster. "You were lucky. We were tracing a distress ping near the Calyx 9 outskirt zone. Picked up your beacon after a long-range scan swept for pre-war signals." Ethan closed his eyes. The beacon worked. "Yes," Salazar said slowly. "It worked. Which brings me to my next question." He turned on a hollow feed. The floating orb's footage. Ethan watched himself dragged through the jungle, the predator looming behind, the fake collapse, the fire, the dead creature dissected, his pulse broadcasts, the flare of the grav drive, and finally his crawl up the ridge with death at his heels. The recording ended with the orb flickering once, then darting off into the sky. "We don't know where it went," Salazar said, "but this footage is everywhere. Some black market relay picked it up and dumped it across a dozen undernet streams. There's already a fan remix." Ethan stared. "A what?" "Someone added synth pop and dramatic slow-motion overlays to your phosphorus flare." Ethan let his head sink back against the pillow. "We analyzed the pulse frequency you used. Do you know what you triggered?" Ethan nodded faintly. "Mating distress signal, with territorial override. Probably called in something possessive." Salazar folded his arms. "That was a suicide move." "Wasn't trying to win," Ethan whispered, "just to make the game stop." There was a long pause. Then Salazar said, "You're not a pilot, are you?" "I was, briefly, after some field work." Salazar stared at the screen. "You manipulated a Zarnax, made it hesitate, react. We've never even confirmed they had social dynamics. Now we've got proof of behavioral complexity, an entire species-level ritual centered around endurance predation and possible intra-species communication. Just needed it not to eat me." "You knew about the smile." Ethan nodded. "We've reviewed your personnel file, your work on pre-contact xenocognitive triggers. You wrote the Amarcus paper." "I was bored," Ethan murmured. "Well, your paper is trending again." The next few days blurred together with treatment. High-dose IV antibiotics, fluid resuscitation, splint adjustments. The swelling in his leg dropped enough for them to operate, inserting a stabilization rod along the tibia. That alone would take 6 weeks minimum before he could bear weight. His ribs were wrapped and braced. His lung capacity hovered at 60%. Salazar made it clear he wouldn't walk for weeks. Full rehab would take months. But he was alive. And in the Coalition's eyes, something more than just a survivor. He was now a case study. Wasn't long before a man in a pressed black suit arrived. "Coalition intelligence." He didn't give his name. He asked questions. "Were you aware the Zarnax was recording 4 others?" "Yes." "Did you understand the orb was transmitting?" "Only near the end." Did you suspect this was a formalized ritual? Behavior pointed that way. Smile was the giveaway. You knew they were testing you. Yes. The man closed his notebook. You didn't break. No, Ethan said softly, but I cracked. The man paused, then actually nodded. We'd like to offer you a consulting position. Xenopsych behaviorist, on retainer. Ethan coughed once, winced. Let me learn to sit up first. The man left, no goodbye. Later that evening, a nurse, young, distracted, smuggling candy wrappers in her uniform, told him his footage had over 12 million views. They're calling you the human who didn't break. Ethan stared at the ceiling. No pressure, he said. Now comes understanding. Rehabilitation was its own jungle. It didn't have glowing plants or apex predators, but it had treadmills that mocked his pace, balance rails he hated, and therapists who smiled far too much for people who routinely made him cry with a stretch. By the third week aboard Seeker's Rise, Ethan could stand for 20 seconds without support. That was a good day. Most of them weren't. His leg was still held together by surgical screws and reinforced carbon rods. His ribs would heal in time, but the scar tissue in his lungs limited deep breaths. He wasn't dying, he just felt like it every morning. But the footage wouldn't die either. It kept spreading, not just on black market streams or encrypted archives, but everywhere. Academic circles, military briefings, even entertainment compilations. People spliced in reaction videos. Someone animated the Zarnax in pastel colors and turned it into a children's cartoon character called Grumpo. The less said about that, the better. Ethan watched none of it. He didn't want to see his pain stylized. Instead, he focused on something that had gone unnoticed. The orb. Frame by frame, he had analyzed its flight patterns, illumination changes, and positioning relative to the Zarnax. Not just a camera, not exactly. It had independent movement, responsive behavior, micro-adjustments that tracked emotion, not just position. It wasn't passive. It was intelligent. He mentioned this to no one, not even Salazar, who'd become something close to a friend. The Coalition's offer still sat unopened in his inbox. It included a commendation, a generous stipend, and early retirement with consult access. Every time he opened the message, he closed it again. Because something was still off. He hadn't won anything. He'd just survived long enough to get interesting. And he wasn't sure who that interested audience really was. On his 45th day of recovery, while practicing steps along the anti-grav gate rail, Ethan was interrupted by a chirping from his neural slate. Not a message, a proximity alert. The ship had docked. It wasn't standard Coalition design, too sleek, too quiet. Civilian registry, but one that hadn't been in any public system for 5 years. Its name, Sable Inquiry, was familiar though. A deep research vessel tied to xenolinguistics and first contact analysis. It had disappeared 2 years into a silent sector. Ethan's blood ran cold. Salazar found him an hour later, back in his quarters, fully dressed, sweating hard from the effort. You shouldn't be on your legs for more than... I'm fine. You're not fine. Ethan turned his slate towards Salazar. This ship, I know the file. Sable Inquiry went dark near the edge of the dry lattice. That was Zarnax adjacent territory. And it's here now. Salazar frowned. That's classified. Ethan looked up. Then maybe someone should be asking why a ship presumed lost near Zarnax space is docking just after a Zarnax test subject appears with an orb that may be more than a camera. You think the ship was taken. I think the Zarnax didn't just evolve predation. I think they evolved collection. Salazar sat down. You're saying they don't just test species. They archive them. Ethan nodded. And if I passed, they'll want more? Hours later, he was granted limited access to the Sable Inquiry. No crew on board. Automated systems only. But one corridor had been reactivated, just one. Its interior had been altered, not vandalized, restructured. The walls were smooth, seamless. Not human alloy, they hummed faintly under his palm. Along the center line of the deck ran a groove, barely visible, like a track for the orb. And at the far end, a chamber lit in soft violet. Ethan stepped inside. It was a gallery. Holograms shimmered in free space. Snapshots, not just of him, but of others, other species, other subjects, all shown in the throes of struggle, emotional extremes, despair, fury, defiance. The Zarnax had recorded more than survival. They recorded moments of identity, a predator archive, but not just for hunting, for understanding. He moved deeper, finding a final console. It activated at his presence, displaying a familiar interface. His own footage, played in reverse, as if asking him to review it. At the end of the video, the smile appeared again. The Zarnax, inches from his face. And for the first time, Ethan realized something else. Its eyes didn't hold hunger. They held hope, not hope for his death, hope for something else. Proof. They didn't believe humans were special. They were hoping to be proven wrong. Frozen moons. A challenge, yes, but also a search. Not a predator's pleasure, but a scientist's test. He returned to Seeker's Rise without a word. Later that week, he finally responded to the Coalition's offer. He declined the retirement. Instead, he sent a single sentence. I want to lead the behavioral division. Salazar showed up the next day with a grin and 2 terrible protein bars. You're a lunatic. You say that like it's a bad thing. Any particular reason you want to stay in this game? Ethan leaned back in his chair, legs still bound, lungs still catching up. They smiled at me, he said, and now I want to know who taught them how. Months later, fully mobile again, Ethan stood on the bridge of the Verity Hollow, a new class research vessel authorized for deep-range xenocognitive fieldwork. His nameplate read Chief Analyst. Somewhere beyond the mapped territories, the Zarnax still roamed. And now, for the first time, they would not be studied from afar. Ethan had survived the jungle. Now he was going to walk into their library. And maybe, just maybe, smile back.